So I'm going to be talking to you about native bee conservation as a whole in a very short time. So let's get started. Firstly, native bees. Now, most people learn about bees in terms of the European honeybee, which is an introduced species in Australia. But we have an incredible diversity of native bees. We have over 2,000 species, and where I conducted my research was in Western Australia, where there's about 800. And most species in Australia are endemic, which means they're found nowhere else in the world. And these are estimates of the species diversity. So there's actually 1,661 described species, but we have hundreds more that are undescribed, which is really exciting, but also a bit scary because there are so many species that have not been given a scientific name. And if we don't know something, we can't study it, we can't protect it. And that's the next issue. Only 4 of these species are given legislative protection, which is a very small fraction. And this is, I guess, goes for invertebrates as a whole. But there is a lot of work to do in native bee conservation. Now, native bees as well are so important for conservation as a whole because of their roles in ecosystems. Now, we have 5 out of the 7 global bee families. We've got Apidae, which includes the same family as the European honeybee, but we've got the Amygilla, or sometimes called blue-banded bees. There's also Amygilla dawsoni and the teddy bear bees. We've got the Megachilidae, which are some of my favourites, and the Australian Wildlife Society helped me write up a publication all about the Megachili and the impact of honeybees on them and their use of bee hotels. We have the Halictidae, which are ground nesting bees, the Coletidae, which is our most diverse family, and the Stenotratidae, which are an entire family that is only found in Australia. And they include that beautiful metallic green bee down the bottom there, Stenocoletes smaragdinus. So incredible diversity. As you can see, they all look very different from honeybees, and their ecology and lifestyles are also very different from honeybees. So protecting honeybees doesn't protect our native bees. Most of our bees are solitary. They don't live in colonies. They don't care for their offspring. We've got some semi-social ones. We've got eusocial ones, like the Tetragonula and Osteoplebia, which are the sugar bag bees that are important part of Indigenous people's culture. Our bees range in size from some of the smallest in the world, 1.9 millimeters long, to some really big ones like the Xylocopa coptodosoma and Amygilla dawsoni. So huge size range. Some of them are very furry, other ones lack hairs completely. So very different from honeybees. Now, a key thing to conserving our native bees is, of course, planting flowers. But what my research has found, that planting any flowers actually won't help our native bees. Our native bees are very specialized. So I've got a publication there. Native flora receive more visits than exotics from bees, especially native bees, in an urbanized biodiversity hotspot. So I conducted my PhD research in the southwest of Western Australia, and I was researching people's gardens as well as bushland remnants and looking at what flowers the native bees were collected from. And so many native bees exclusively foraged on native plants. Many of our native bees are very specialized. They will only forage on Myrtaceae or only forage on Fabaceae. So even if you have a garden that is full of flowers, it can essentially be a desert for our native bees. And I found actually that the more flower species there were in the garden, the fewer native bees there were, which goes against, I guess, conventional common knowledge, but that's because our native bees are specialized. And we know Australia is a continent that's been isolated from other continents for hundreds of thousands of years. And, you know, if we just look at our marsupials, weird wildlife that have their own ecological niche that do things a bit differently to animals in the Northern Hemisphere. Same with our native bees. So high proportions of native flora, in particular the Myrtaceae and the Fabaceae, can't go wrong with those. And as you'll also notice, these plants in these families are trees and shrubs. So I guess against what we learn in, I guess, for honeybees plants lots of like sort of ground dwelling flowers. Lots of our native bees need those big flowering trees. So we need to keep trees. We need to keep those street verge trees, and yeah, plant lots of natives. But our native bees don't just need food, they also need somewhere to live. Unlike honeybees, they can't be managed in colonies except for the sugar bag bees. The majority of our native bees, they are wild, and we can't just put them in a hive. So a large proportion of them nest in pre-made cavities in wood created by wood-boring beetles. So we need to have intact ecosystems. We need to keep our trees. But we can also help supplement these resources with bee hotels, but not just any bee hotels. We need to make sure these are designed correctly. The hole diameters need between 3 millimeters and 10 millimeters. They need to be at least 100 millimeters deep. We should use wood that hasn't been treated with pesticides or fungicides. And we can create bee hotels by drilling holes in wood or getting bamboo and stacking them together and installing them in sunny locations, but not direct sun, at about head height. And I have published a paper all about the use of bee hotels by native bees. Some native bees love them, other ones won't use them. So you actually have a different proportion of bees that you see that can use them in the field versus the cavity nesting bees that are flying around. But they are a very useful tool, and I have a paper that is under review where I was able to look at the pollen contents inside the bee hotels, rear hundreds of thousands of nests, and look at that in relation to the honeybee densities in the area. So they're actually really good at not looking at just how honeybees affect how many native bees are foraging in an area, but the honeybee impacts on fitness, that is the reproductive output of the native bees, which is, of course, the key thing. They need to be able to reproduce. So yeah, stay tuned, because that's the paper that the Australian Wildlife Society helped me write, and it's under review, so hopefully it'll be out soon. We've also got ground nesting bees, so we need to leave patches of bare soil. Of course, not put fake grass down, minimize tilling our garden beds. And of course, in urban areas, limit putting down lots of pavement. Pesticides, we don't need to use them in gardens. Targeted next generation pesticides can be good if it means that we have to clear less native vegetation. Herbicides are, again, mixed bag. If we're using them to clear invasive grasses or invasive weeds, they can be good, provided that we plant native plants so that it's not just nothing left for the bees. So yeah, limit pesticides is, I guess, the take-home message, but if we are using them, use them in a conscious way so that we can actually help boost native flora for our native bees. Animal agriculture is a major issue for biodiversity as a whole, as I'm sure we all know. And in addition to massive land clearing of rainforest, animal agriculture is the main cause of land clearing in Queensland, which is where I am now. But it is also a major contributor to climate change. And this is something that I have published a chapter on. And it disrupts the synchronicity between the activity periods between bees and flowers. Places are now getting too warm for the bees and the plants. We see animals and plants migrating, but because bees are so closely tied to their floral resources, they need to migrate at the same rate. In Australia, I guess the main effect we're seeing of climate change is droughts and bushfires, which of course have major impacts on our native bees. So, disrupting the nectar flow, destroying habitats, and also the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is altering the nectar and pollen chemistry. So many, many impacts here of climate change and land clearing on the native bees. But the good thing is that everyone can contribute to reducing this threat by reducing your meat intake. So going vegetarian, you cut your carbon footprint by half, and many other benefits to biodiversity as a whole, especially here in Australia, where our landscapes have not evolved with hoofed animals. Now, to understand how our native bees are doing, we need to be monitoring their populations, and this is not happening. most native bees, we don't have long-term records, that we can sort of do space for time comparisons instead. But you need to use the right monitoring methods. And so this was a core part of my research as well. And I was comparing passive methods, putting out bee bowls, vane traps. These are colored, essentially, traps that attract the bees based on color. And then I was also going out and actually collecting the bees. A big finding was that you actually need to go out in the field and collect bees, which for someone like me, I'm very happy to do, but it does mean a lot more person power and a lot more expertise than putting out coloured pan traps. But the issue with these is that the coloured pan traps, they collect more bees in bad habitats. And so there's actually been studies that have been published where they've just used these pan traps and have said bees are doing better in, managed agricultural landscapes and in native bushland. But if you go to these habitats, that's not what you physically see. It's because in bad habitats, when there's not many floral resources, the bees are going to go to these pan traps rather than go to the flowers. So we definitely need to make sure that when we're doing any bee monitoring, we need to use the right methods. And another big issue is that we are severely lacking in taxonomic investment and expertise in Australia. As I said, we've got hundreds of species that are undescribed, and that's because there is actually no taxonomy courses or degrees in bee taxonomy or in invertebrate taxonomy in Australia, and there's no investment in taxonomy. So being able to identify species is, of course, at the core of any biodiversity assessment. We need to know how many species there are in an area, but identifying bees is very, very difficult because their diagnostic features are microscopic. Many genera don't have keys. The descriptions were hundreds of years old, and so we've got a lot of work to do there in that regard. But taxonomy is, I guess, at the very base of any biodiversity assessment, and so we need to really get that right to properly understand and conserve our native bees. So yeah, we need to invest into taxonomy and also make sure that when people are reviewing any papers on pollinators, they're aware of the limitations of the methods that are being used. So another issue is honeybees. Introduced species. Honeybees are getting a lot of press at the moment because varroa mite has recently been found in Australia for about a year. It is a threat to honeybees. It's not a threat to native bees, fortunately, but some of the eradication measures, such as putting out toxic bakes, could be. But honeybees themselves are a threat to native bees. And so varroa mite actually might help our native bees actually get a bit of the leg up. And I have been researching specifically how honeybees impact native bees, and they do cause competition for floral resources for the native bees that are specialised and have a high resource overlap. And they also impact the pollination networks. So this is the plant-pollinator interactions, and they change how robust these networks are and how connected they are, making them more vulnerable to disruptions. So if anyone wants to read more about that, those are my papers. So sustainability of beekeeping is something that we need to be really careful about. Getting a honeybee colony in your backyard is not a solution to helping the bee problem. It will actually exacerbate the problem of bee conservation. Even with the sugar bag bees, these are the native ones that you can keep across the north of Australia down to Sydney. We do need to make sure that these are managed sustainably as well. And I think we just had to talk about, cats and dogs. People have to register their cats and dogs. I think honeybees as a domesticated species, we should be registering them because they are also like, cats, a species that when they go feral, they can cause a lot of problems, not only for our native bees, but for our native possums and our native birds. So as I talked about, taxonomic impediment is something that is facing invertebrate conservation as a whole. There are hundreds of species that are undescribed. Many genera don't have keys. And with the advent of DNA barcoding, we're also finding that we have to do a lot of revisions because species have been described a number of times, and it's actually the same species. I described the most recent bee, 1661st species, Leoproptis zephyr. I named it after my dog. It's a very cool bee. No conservation legislation for it, no recovery plans. It's only found in 5 places, forages on 2 species of plants. You know, if this was a mammal, like, it would be critically endangered. Everyone would be like looking out for it, because it's a native bee, unfortunately, not so protected. We need to invest more in niche topics like the natural history of species. Our native bees, so many, we don't even know what they forage on, where they nest, what their nesting substrate is, what their limiting factors are. And yeah, we need greater incentives for people to get into native bees, to publish research, and they need to be part of any sort of impact assessment, because if you want to clear habitat, you do need to look out for koalas. You don't need to do any assessments of how many native bees there are in the area. And of course, we need to actually get our native bees some legislative protection. Devil in the details, I guess, is the main overall summary of my research. Plant flowers, but we need to make sure we know what flowers we're planting and what sort of bees need those particular flowers. Increasing populations of native bees, if they're sugar bag bees, they're also managed, so we need to make sure we do that. Sustainability, outright ban on herbicides, probably not the best idea in some contexts. Installing bee hotels is a good idea, provided that they are designed correctly. The great thing about native bees is that people can contribute to their conservation, because they can be found everywhere in your backyard. Almost certainly you have native bees in your backyard, especially if you live in Perth. But they are around everywhere, our suburbs, and once you know what to look for, you'll start seeing them. And you can contribute to the monitoring of native bees. So I've got a citizen science project on my Facebook group, The Buzz on Wild Bees. And so you can go there and learn more about native bees and how to identify them. I've got a book as well on how to create bee hotels, and a big list of some of the best plants to plant for your native bees. So you can check that out as well. That's my email there if you want to get in touch.